Welcome to the Persuasive Mindset, your podcast guide to mastering the art of persuasion by exploring its role across diverse fields through a series of in-depth conversations with experts. I am your host, Dr. Serena Mate de Londra. Today we have the pleasure of speaking with Mr. Itonde Kakoma, the President and CEO of Interpeace, which is a Geneva-based international peacebuilding organization. For over 30 years, Interpeace has been at the forefront of working towards creating sustainable peace in some of the world's most challenging conflict-affected regions. In this episode, we explore the transformative journey of Interpeace and learn about its impactful work in countries like Somalia and Rwanda. As well, Mr. Kakoma shares lessons from his distinguished career and reflects on his current role, which he describes as being an ambassador for peace. One of the central themes discussed in this interview is the role of persuasion in peacebuilding and the power it can have to help foster dialogue and offer alternatives to violence. Mr. Kakoma, interestingly, makes a clear distinction between persuasion and convincing by stating the following.
Convince is something else. If we are unable to persuade in terms of making a compelling case for peace, then we fail in our core mission and mandate as an organization. And in order to do that, it behooves us to not only talk about, but really highlight where impact occurs. And in doing so, shifting perhaps, even if in a decimal by decimal way, the narrative which we hear resoundingly today for the calls to more investment in more conflict means that states and peoples generally will be interested in how they shore up their reserves literally so as to be able to defend. But our job is to also be able to persuade that alternatives to conflict can also entail non-violent means of coming to a settlement. It's essential.
Additionally, Mr. Kakoma discusses the challenges of working in the peacebuilding field, which continues to be shaped by a rising number of global and internal conflicts. As well, he highlights the evolving role of trust in reconciliation processes and addresses the need for sustained community engagement and much more. As always, the interview concludes with practical advice for aspiring peace builders. Now, let's dive into our conversation with Mr. Itonde Kakoma. Enjoy! As Interpeace celebrates its 30th anniversary this year, I'd like to ask, how would you describe its origins and unique mission in the field of peacebuilding, and what distinguishes Interpeace from other organizations dedicated to similar causes?
I would describe Interpeace first and foremost as we have been constituted by way of Swiss law as an international organization for peace building. The timing of our discussion or conversation, Serena, is really interesting in light of what you open with, because we're marking 30 years as a peace building organization. In fairness, we have evolved over those years. So if we go back 30 years, who are we, as your question stipulates? If we go back over those 30 years, we take a few forms. First, in 1994, we are known as the War-Torn Societies Project, WARTORN, War-Torn Societies Project. And we were founded as an initiative, a thinking platform and doing platform within the United Nations system. Now, why the language of war-torn? It's 1994. There have been a series of cataclysmic changes in a post-Cold War environment. So for some of the world, let's say dominant, less polemic world, post-Cold War, they experienced a sense of greater stability. For some of the rest of the world, it kicked off a considerable amount of instability within states. And the war-torn aspect there echoes what is occurring in the 90s and specifically at the moment where we are. Not by chance, we're marking 30 years as an organization at the same time that, for example, and significantly, the people of Rwanda, and for that matter, the world, are marking the 30th commemorations of the genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda, which occurred in 1994. That's a part of a cyclical way in which widespread armed conflict, in this case amounting not just to gross crimes against humanity, but specifically genocide, have occurred within the Great Lakes in a cyclical form. Equally so, in 1994 and the years surrounding it, you found in Central America, to Southeast Asia, to the Balkans, various forms of instability, war-torn societies, hence our birth. Now, a birth, you asked about uniqueness, and let's see if this allows us to get to any of the other questions, Sorina. A birth that is rooted in a couple of fundamentals, but the one I will highlight is around ownership. That is, working from not just the premise or value proposition, but a real sense of devoted pursuit to the understanding that sustainable peace will only be achieved if it is owned by the very individuals, communities, societies, states that are experiencing, going through, enduring the very conflicts of which we're speaking, as opposed to an interventionist approach. And that's part and parcel of how we come into formation as an organization. Interesting enough, it is also reflective now, I would say, of an ethos and approach of like-minded organizations that champion the spirit of localization beyond the mantra into how we actually operate. Serena, if you allow me one last point, it matters that our founding is in Geneva, and it matters that our continuity remains here, whilst deeply rooted by way of communities themselves, with full backing of states and their respective leadership. But it matters that we are here because Geneva has had a tradition of hosting organizations and being a champion, if you will, or a seat in which individuals envision alternatives to conflict as a means of resolving difference. And not just one-off, but through the establishment of lasting institutions. I hope that our legacy as an organization is a contribution to that vision and that pursuit that this city of Geneva has embodied in so many ways.
Given that you lead an organization which is dedicated to peace at a time when both internal and international conflicts are increasing globally, can you please describe your current role at Interpeace and also provide us with some examples of your main work-related priorities?
I serve as President and Chief Executive Officer of Interpeace. I'm based at our headquarters in Geneva, Switzerland. And my role is evolving. Had we spoken 10 months ago, I may have said something differently. Had we spoken 5 months ago, I would have been in conversation with you. Today, I'm focused on a few things. First, I'm reminding myself of how our governing board put forward the call to serve as president and CEO publicly. And the description of the role was to be an ambassador for peace. This was such an attractive framing. And I believe that's not just about the individual role or office that I currently occupy, but an expression of intent for our organization, if not sector at large, to be an ambassador for peace. Sorina, this is further situated within an environment of increased conflicts. If 30 years ago, the emphasis of our work and approach was on conflicts within states, that is, internal armed conflicts, non-international armed conflicts, that's because of the prevalence of them 30 years ago. Today, statistically, as made evident by the Global Peace Index, those conflicts continue now and are in fact on the rise. We're seeing the highest number of conflicts since the end of the Second World War. But it's not just non-international armed conflicts. It is coupled by, or further compounded by, the prevalence and increase of precisely international armed conflicts. That is, conflicts or wars between states, not just within states. So, to use the phrasing of ambassador for peace by way of a role or an organization, at a moment where you have those dire trends, is not a small calling, but it's a necessary one. And I would like to think that the totality of what we aim to do is in pursuit of that goal, to be ambassadors for peace. Having said that, it's also quite practical. Serena, it's also about how we run an organization smartly, professionally, credibly, in an ever-changing global landscape, where the other trends we observe are a diminishment of the very systems, funding mechanisms, arguably even commitments to upholding norms that our organization comes out of, if not embodies. That has consequence for our whole sector and for the organization I am privileged to lead today. So a lot of my time is also spent on trying to better understand global trends so as not simply to be subjects of them, but to anticipate and respond with the credibility and professionalism required.
Could you share some examples of Interpeace's long-standing work that reflects its unique approach to peace building? And at the same time, can you also address how has your organization's role evolved over the years, particularly in countries where you've been present for decades?
I'd be honored to. The case I would lift up is also reflective of our long-standing presence. So I'd point to our ongoing work in Somalia. Serena, in the last couple of months, we were privileged to, and it's public, hold bilateral discussions with the leadership of Somalia, the level of the head of state, together with his team and our respective leadership, accompanied by our chair of the board and distinguished board members and our regional leadership, in which we reflected on work together, that is, accompanying the Somali people over the entirety of our existence, that is 30 years. And what's fascinating to me, Serena, is that despite having been in Somalia at the invitation of the Somali people and the respective authorities for 3 decades, our sense is that trust, as established over those years, enables us to be perhaps even more relevant today. How so? With regards to accompanying the necessary but fragile processes of reconciliation within, but doing so with the humility that 30 years ago, the absence of robust state systems now have come of age and are taking on increased levels, rightly so, of sovereign responsibility. Equally so, the building up of, by way of Somali leadership, of robust civil society mechanisms means that the role of an external organization, even if in an intermediary manner, has to change, if not diminish. Why? It goes back to those founding premises, if you will, value proposition, and understanding of what makes for sustainable peace, which we spoke of earlier, around ownership. And so our work today in Somalia, yes, ever more relevant because of long established trust, but also undertaking an evolution that recognizes considerable gains, notwithstanding challenges to maintaining stability, but considerable gains by way of state structures and non-governmental civil society structures within Somali society that is enabling us to serve in new ways, whilst responding to the request to accompany reconciliation processes under the leadership of Somali people themselves. And I think that is an example that resonates in so many other places where we work. By comparison, I was honored to represent our organization at the invitation of the government of Rwanda for the official 30th commemoration of the genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda, and was profoundly moved by, over a similar, more than 2 decades strong, building of trust with Rwandan people, how, as an organization, we are able to accompany what is ultimately an intergenerational process of restoration and reconciliation at a national level, at a communal level, at an individual level, because of the proximity, the way in which armed conflict in 1994, again amounting to genocide against the Tutsi, was proximate or neighborly. Thus, to restore and reconcile from such an experience requires an awareness of proximity, of neighborliness as well, whilst putting in place institutional structures that prevent the return to widespread armed conflict. And there, in particular, we as an organization, together with partners under the leadership of the people of Rwanda, through the government and national organizations, have also identified the significance of the mind, that is, the human mind, the psyche. And then if we're not able to deal with the trauma of war, it's going to be really difficult to envision alternatives to the use of violence as a means of resolving difference.
How do you define persuasion, and what role does it play in Interpeace's approach to peace building?
I love this question, Sorina, because if we are unable to persuade, convince is something else. If we are unable to persuade in terms of making a compelling case for peace, then we fail in our core mission and mandate as an organization. And in order to do that, it behooves us to not only show, talk about, but really highlight where impact occurs. And in doing so, shifting perhaps, even if in a decimal by decimal way, the narrative which we hear resoundingly today for the calls to more investment in more conflict means that states and peoples generally will be interested in how they shore up their reserves, literally, so as to be able to defend. But our job is to also be able to persuade that alternatives to conflict can also entail non-violent means of coming to a settlement. It's essential. I would love, Serena, to share with you a story of the art of persuasion, where I witnessed a former head of state with whom I was honored to be working very closely sit with, frankly, a dictator of a country that was going through a tumultuous period. And I'll never forget his opening remarks, where he said to him, he's now ousted. And unsurprisingly, since his ousting, his country has spiraled downwards into widespread armed conflict and the sheer destruction of their capital because of the lack of investment beyond the few centers of power, mostly invested in men and men with guns. But I'll never forget that conversation where he started it with saying, I'm not here to convince you, but I may be able to persuade you in light of these following propositions. And he proceeded to share with him 1, 2, 3 points that led to an open and honest conversation about alternatives to violence as a means of resolving difference. So persuasion is as much as getting your argument right as it is about creating a space in which to have a genuine opportunity to listen, which may create changes in our own, not just someone else's, perception of what is possible.
I'd like to shift our focus now to the topic of career development. And in hindsight, what is an example of a formative educational or work-related experience that you believe has helped shape or guide your career?
I know exactly what I want to say, but I don't usually share it.
That's so nice of you, but please keep in mind that you do not have to share anything that you do not want to share with us today.
No, I'm going to share with you, Serena. So, many years ago, I think the most formative experience I had, well, let me start with this, language. The study of any language in depth. In my case, ancient, no longer spoken languages have been extremely valuable in entering into the mystery of human interaction and meaning, and the grayness with which interpretation of no longer spoken languages and what that means then for an ability to assert, if you will, proclaim, or frankly, rely upon definitive understandings of what is truth. But it opens up a broader area of accepting mystery. It's been extremely valuable for me, and not being stuck between this is the only way or that is the only way. There are multiplicity of meanings in interpretive processes without diminishing the truth in those interpretations. I think that would be the most important thing I would share.
Thank you very much for sharing with us this unique experience. And now, as we reach the end of our conversation, I'd like to ask, what advice would you give to young professionals aiming for a career similar to yours?
I would say study, get your immersion in university and so forth, but even more so, beyond that, I think what I still benefit from was an earlier, perhaps still embodied passion for the field that I have, which means that I enter into reading and study in a very different way, and constantly trying to hone skills, not only through desk research, but constant conversation with professionals in whom I look up to. And here is not just those who are living, but those who have passed and who have paper trails and documentaries, and immersing myself into their worlds. That would be my urging, is to try and understand how individuals in fields of advancing peace have gone about their own journey. But in doing so is not to mirror or try to do the same path. On the contrary, it's to gain an appreciation for the diversity of perspective that is brought to the table when advancing peace. And that's critical, because that brings about a more human-centered approach to what we do.
And on that positive note, thank you very much for taking the time to speak with us today.
Thank you, Sorina.
That concludes our conversation with Mr. Itonde Kakoma. If you enjoyed this discussion, please be sure to subscribe, leave a comment, and share this episode with others who might benefit from it. Until next time, be well!